Hey friends, Noah from Corporate Streams. Today we're going to be speculating about the ATEM 2ME production upgrade.
Be seen, heard, and better understood through virtual gatherings. Elevate your message with Corporate Streams.
Now, this product has been out for a very long time, so the first thing we're going to do is go over the product, all of its specs, and then I'm going to go line by line and tell you some of the wish list things that I have about this product and the things that I would like to see upgraded. So taking a look here, we're going to go ahead and go to the Blackmagic website. As you probably know, there are several different cheaper switchers that have been put out since the ATEM 2ME, which is all the way down here. ATEM 2ME Production Studio 4K, what a mouthful. It's currently being sold for $4,000, so quite an expensive switcher relative to the other Blackmagic products. But if you have any sort of background with live switching or live events, you'll know that this is actually super affordable compared to the classic TriCasters or raw switchers or other high-end video switchers. So $4,000 might seem like a lot in today's terms with all of the technology and how quickly it's evolved, but in traditional broadcast, $4,000 is a steal. So anyways, let's get back to it. So there's also the flagship product, which is out, which is the ATEM Constellation 8K. So in our speculation, we're going to be trying to figure out features that would fit into a 2ME versus the 4ME or 8K Constellation that's out as well. So we've got to kind of balance the two. And when we do the speculation, it's got to fit between that and then the cheaper ATEM Mini Extremes as well, right? So if we come back up here, the ATEM Mini Extremes are the newest products in their lineup, and those are kind of at the prosumer level, the prosumer market. So really everything in this ATEM television studio level, from the HD to the Pro to the 4K, everything in here is close to a product upgrade. But even more so, the rack unit line, right? The 1ME, 2ME, and 4ME, these are definitely prime candidates for upgrading. And you can kind of tell because they've changed the look, right? And let me do a quick Google search here. Okay, so I couldn't really find it right off the bat. So if I'm able to find it, I will go ahead and put in the lower third the year of each one of these products and when it was released. That way you can kind of see how old a lot of these are. I know for sure the ATEM 2ME, the one that I have, which is a 20 input 4K switcher, that one's at least 7 years old, at least 2015, maybe even older. So a lot of these mid to high end switchers for Blackmagic haven't been upgraded in a very long time. So we're kind of anticipating that. Really, for a couple of years, we've been anticipating these upgrades, which haven't happened yet. Okay, so the ATEM Production Studio 4K is a lineup of different products, and we're going to go through each one of these and what they offer. You can see on their website there are videos and that kind of stuff. Also, you can get this in text form, but hey, I'm explaining all this. So there is one thing that definitely distinguishes the group, which is like the 1ME feature versus 2 or 4 MEs. So what that basically means is you have separate cut buses. So you can have a separate program when you have more than 1 ME. That means you could have 2 rooms being directed simultaneously within the same switcher, or if you have a Spanish and an English or a multilingual show, you can have 2 different directors using the same camera inputs, having their own cut for the show. This is also helpful if you need to output to iMag, monitors, or other things within a system, right? If you're a larger church or your facility that has rooms that have satellite video feeds going into them, having extra MEs allows you to create a separate program feed so that those rooms have a different switch rather than having everything on the same 1 ME channel. So that's one of the big benefits of the bigger switchers there. So yeah, the 4ME can go up to 20 inputs, which are 12G SDI, right? So it's a 4K input. There are also these 1ME advanced control panels. So these are separate. Now, these are not a switcher in itself. It's just a control unit. So this is around $3,000 just for the control interface, which is similar to the Production TV Studio 4K, which my church uses on a regular basis. This control panel allows you to have those hardware buttons because a lot of these units are just rack mounted. So as you can see, the Production Studio 4K, the 1ME, 2ME, the 4ME, and the Constellation are all rack mounted units. And then they sell separately this 1ME advanced control panel. There's also a 2ME advanced control panel, which is obviously much bigger and has a lot more buttons. And then if you want the big Bertha of them all, there is a 4ME advanced control panel, which is a little over $18,000. So not only does this look cool, but it gives you all those buttons at your fingertips, so you don't have to switch between menus or submenus or shift keys and that kind of stuff. That's what's really nice. So if you have the budget and if you're part of a large studio with multiple rooms and you want a master control suite, that's the thing you want. That's why they offer this as a product. One last thing about controllers, there are camera controllers as well, which allow you to do shading. That helps you to balance each one of the cameras and make sure that the colors look succinct and everything looks the same. But enough about controllers. Let's go ahead and go back up and work our way through the features here. So once again, this is a lineup. So depending on your needs, you'll buy the piece of gear that fits what you need. There's the ATEM Production Studio 4K, 1E Production Studio 4K, and then the 2ME Broadcast Studio 4K, and the ATEM 4ME Broadcast Studio 4K. Why does Blackmagic name these products like that? I don't know. You could basically drop production or studio to the name and just call it the ATEM 1ME or the ATEM 4K or just the ATEM 1U. I don't know. There's naming conventions are always tough. Now with each one of these switchers, you also have software control, which is what it's pointing out right here. You can't control it via hardware, which is, in my opinion, always preferred, but it's really up to you. Sometimes having a software controller is also really nice. Now in my particular case, I'm gonna go ahead to my overhead shot and you'll see I have a Stream Deck, which allows me to do custom buttons and custom layouts. So on this particular page, I have a record button and shows me how much time I've been recording for. I have a streaming button in case I want to live stream. And then I have a couple presets. Now these are macros, which you set in the ATEM software, which allow me to get different shots like this picture-in-picture that you see now, or this camera one shot. We'll go back to the picture-in-picture 2, which is this setup. And then I also have the computer setup like this. And so depending on what I need, I can set those up. And that's what's cool about the software control. Now, again, Stream Deck is a separate thing. You pay for this controller. This one was $60 for the 6 key. And I do have a review / comparison between the Stream Deck lineup, which is the 6 key, 15 key, and 32 key. But that's gonna be on my Hacking Hollywood channel, which is a separate channel. So I'll link that in the description below. Anyways, you can use a Stream Deck with a free software program called Companion, and that's gonna allow you to control your ATEM. And so in my case, I'm using an ATEM Mini Pro, but the companion software can control the ATEM lineup as a whole. And then the Stream Deck buttons can be programmed. I'll show you another page. So this is gonna be my teleprompter view. So even if I press these buttons, you're not gonna see the difference, but to me, I can see what's on screen and that changes it in my prompter for me. So anyways, let's go back. We talked about the larger panels, the larger design there. So I will note for most of these units, the ones that I'm talking about that need upgrading are the rack mounted units, and they have different plugs. A lot of stuff is SDI based. We're gonna focus on these 3 plus the one a little further down, the 4ME. I don't know why Blackmagic has decided to put the controllers in between their lineup here, but it is what it is on their website. So I went ahead on these other tabs here. We have Production Studio 4K. We have the 1ME Production Studio 4K, the 2ME Production Studio 4K, and then the 4ME. Now, going back to the 1ME, this one has 10-bit inputs on everything. They have 4 6G SDI inputs, 4 HDMI inputs, all up to 4K. So this particular one splits those inputs, and that's the major difference there. Now this can do up to 4K, and there are older models that do only 1080p, but that's something to note that this can do 4K. Now, monitoring wise, it does point out that it's only in HD. So keep that in mind. You will not get a 4K signal. It doesn't really say anything about scalers built into these. And that's another thing to note about these older gray models. The gray tells you that it's the last generation, right? It's not the newest stuff. But let's jump over to the 1ME and look at that. So this is focused more on SDI. So it has 1 HDMI and it has 10 6G SDI inputs. I will note that the 1 HDMI input takes up the space of 1. So it's either the SDI for 1 or the HDMI for 1. It's one or the other. You don't get both there. I do like that you have 10 inputs instead of 8 compared to just the production studio here. And then as we move down the line, we'll look at the 2ME. Now this is where it starts to really get beefed up here, because this has 20 inputs and outputs, and it has a single HDMI output, just like the other one where it's channel 1. You can either do HDMI or you can do 26G SDI inputs. It has the 2ME switching, and again, that has to do with output, so you can basically have 2 different program outs and 2 different previews, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, we have the 4ME, which also has 20 inputs, but the main feature here is that it goes up in MEs and it has 4 instead of 2. Now in this lineup, they do have multi-view outputs, and so depending on your model, you might have the 16 camera layout, which is available on the 2ME and the 4ME, or you might have the standard 8 multi-view output on the 1ME and the production studio switchers. You do have the same creative transitions and digital effects that you have. You have Super Source in the 2ME and higher, which allows you to have multiple images on the screen like this. That's one thing that gets kind of competitive. The ATEM Mini Extreme has Super Source, but the production studio and the 1ME still do not have Super Source in their systems. It has dual media players with a large graphics memory. So this is an image sequence that can play TGA, PNG, or TIFF sequences. It also has an advanced chroma key here. So depending on your model, you might have multiple chroma keys, so feel free to read through that to know the specifics there. And you can also control hyperdeck through these switchers, and of course macros, which is kind of what I explained on the ATEM Mini Pro that I'm using now. It also can do up to 4K ultra high def here. Now this is one of the caveats here. The 2ME does not have built-in scalers, and so that's one of the Achilles heel that I keep running into. I'll have computers or teleprompters or really sometimes multiple cameras, and I want to bring all of those into my 20 input 2ME switcher, and I'm not always able to do that because of different resolutions and frame rates and that kind of thing. So to have a built-in scaler where all of these things just get synchronized and it's easy, that's what's missing on this 2ME currently. And so that's why I recommended to my church they go with this switcher. This is called the Television Studio Pro 4K Live Production Switcher. Again, another mouthful. And if we look at the back of the unit, it has 8 SDI inputs. It also has 8 SDI outputs, which we'll talk about in a moment. It does not have HDMI input. It has a single multi-view out via HDMI. So this switcher came out a few years after the lineup that we're talking about, right? So you can tell in the main picture here, it is black, whereas these rack mounted units are still gray, right? So you can kind of tell generationally that the black switchers are their newest offering, right? And the newest in their lineup. And so there are some features in this switcher that are not in the gray switcher. And that's what's kind of interesting too. Just like this Television Studio Pro 4K, the ATEM Mini Extreme also has a few of the features that this one doesn't even have. And the gray ones definitely don't have, which is super source and that kind of stuff. So Blackmagic kind of has this outdated lineup here where some of the lower priced items actually have more features than the higher priced items, which is kind of confusing, but the thing that they're holding out on is SDI. Most video professionals like myself prefer SDI over HDMI 100%, and a lot of people are jumping over to NDI, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So a quick recap here. We have our 4 different levels of switchers that are outdated, right? All of these gray ones here that we just went through and talked about. The 1, 2, 4 MEs, and then the regular Production Studio 4K as well. And then we talked about this Television Studio Pro 4K, which has a different name, sometimes gets confused, but it's an all-in-one switcher. It looks kind of like the control panel, but it's separate, it's different. So a lot of convoluted things happening here. And to top it all off, there is another model within this whole thing, and that's the HD version of this. It does not have scalers. It's $700 cheaper, and it pretty much looks the same, except it does 4 HDMI inputs and 4 SDI inputs on the back of the switcher, but again, it's limited to 1080p. So Blackmagic, I really encourage you to do some updates. We're all chomping at the bit, so to speak, for the 2ME to be upgraded, a larger 20 input switcher with scalers and that kind of stuff. And I could jump up to the Constellation 8K. I am pretty sure that you guys are going to be releasing something soon, and that's kind of what I'm holding out on. There are some other features here that I want to just quickly note, like the remote camera control, the professional audio mixer that's built into the software, and then you do have some aux outs depending on your switcher. So those are all useful if you need to basically select a multi-monitor setup here and say, you know, camera 1's always on this one, camera 2's always on this one, or whatever you have. You can also get some control panels here. This one's showing the original unit on the front here. I believe that's the 4ME, but of course you could have a punch button set up here. So look into that if that's something that you need. All right, so now that we've dissected the current lineup, let's go ahead and talk about the 2 products that this will fall in between, and that's gonna be the Constellation 8K and the ATEM Mini Extreme. I'm gonna go ahead and kind of skip over this Television Studio Pro 4K, the one that I kind of mentioned, because I also kind of categorize this as the older generation, even though it's just one generation older instead of like 2 or 3 like these gray ones are. So it's kind of like the ATEM Mini line is the children, this is kind of like the parents, and then these are like the grandparents. So basically we're hoping that the grandparents get updated in this whole lineup comparison here. And this Constellation is their flagship switcher essentially, right? So this is still the highest thing that they offer, the best of the best. So let's start with ATEM Constellation 8K. I know my face is kind of covering that there. Here, let me show you. It is an 8K switcher. Not a lot of us are doing 8K productions. We all know that. There are some things that need to happen trickery-wise to make 8K work, but we're going to go through and talk about that a little bit. So this is technically a 40 input switcher. It can do 40 12G SDI inputs, and that's what it takes to do an 8K setup. And so basically 4 of those SDIs become quad link 4K SDI, if I'm saying all that right. And those 4 channels become an 8K picture. And so with that 8K picture, you limit your input ability down to 10 inputs, which is still crazy, 10 8K sources. So if you want that 8K workflow, that's one of the limitations here. It isn't 40 inputs of 8K, which is probably what they're going to do to upgrade this one in the future. But hey, keep that in mind. If you're like me and you're going to keep it in 4K, that means you do have use of all 40 of those inputs, which for me is a little bit of an overkill. It also has 24 12G aux outs. So what that means is you could basically route to 24 different destinations and say camera 1 goes here, camera 2 goes there, or what have you. 24 is a lot. That's a lot of great inputs, which is great. It has 4 DVEs, 16 keyers, 4 media players, 2 super sources, standard conversions on every SDI input. That's the one thing that I'm pretty confident and really hoping for on the ATEM 2 ME upgrade, at least for me, so I have that scalability like I mentioned just a moment ago. What's even crazier is it can take in audio from all of these channels, and you can go up to 156 channels of audio and take that into the Fairlight audio mixer, which has EQ and dynamics, plus the free ATEM software control. So you can control this unit with other controllers like the X keys or the Stream Deck. You can select the format like I said before, and of course it's got a full front panel which you can punch in. This is what the back of the unit looks like. Pretty impressive. A lot of things fitting in this 2U rack, right? So you got a lot of things being jam-packed into here. Redundant power controls, you have Ethernet, USB, of course, and then the 40 inputs like we talked about, the 24 outputs. And so that kind of sacrificed a lot of space, so they had to go with a 1/4 inch input for your audio. They also reference the hardware panels and hardware controllers, which would be a really nice thing to have if you have this 8K Constellation. Why not have a controller as well? And then you have multi-view outputs. Now this is one of the layouts that they're showing here. Basically, you can have 1, 2, 3, 4 different outputs, right? And you can change the outputs to whatever format and setup you want, depending on your preference. You could have 16 cameras in one multi-view, you can have 2 and 2, or a quad view essentially. So that's what's nice about having 4 multi-view outputs in this setup. Of course, you have the broadcast transitions, the DVE, stingers, and more. So this one actually has built-in stingers, which is what separates this one from a lot of the other switchers that Blackmagic offers. And a stinger is that transition between shots. So I don't have one built in here, but basically it would roll across the screen or do some sort of graphic transition, which is kind of cool that it's built into this high-end switcher. I'm sure we're gonna see this trickle down to the low-end switchers as time progresses. You also have a talkback feature, so if you do comms over the Blackmagic setup, you can do that as well. And then you can do image sequences, graphics all built in as well. Of course, the ATEM Advanced Keyer is there. One of the things I'd like to point out is the ATEM Mini, the $300 switcher, has that same chroma key as this 8K Constellation. So it's pretty incredible that the low-end consumer level switchers have this built-in chroma keyer. However, it's not necessarily about the keyer. I would recommend getting your lighting right. So if you want to watch a video on that, I've done that on my channel, so feel free to check that out. So you can kind of see the scale here of the native 8K, right? What that looks like versus 4K versus 1080p, 720p, and then standard definition would be even smaller than that, which is not even listed here. Kind of crazy. You can see the controllers that they're kind of showing off here. So if you have the budget for the high-end stuff, you might have the budget for the controllers as well. The software looks a little bit more advanced. And then once again, you have the 1ME, 2ME, and the 4ME advanced control panels. Okay, let's look at the ATEM Mini. Now you'll probably see on my channel, I do a more in-depth review of the ATEM Mini Extreme and when it came out and what it could do. The main features here, ATEM Mini Extreme can do 8 HDMI inputs. It has 2 aux outs, which can be program or multi-view. It does have Super Source, and it's really geared at consumer level stuff because of HDMI. Yeah, so the ATEM Mini Extreme ISO has 2 USBs, one to be used for a USB interface and the other can be for a hard drive. So that way you can record locally. And the cool thing about the ATEM Mini is there's an ISO version. So that ISO allows you to have individual recordings of each input that you have. So that would be something impressive that we can talk about possibly seeing in the 2ME upgrade. It also can live stream directly from the hardware, right? The ATEM Mini Pro, the ATEM Mini Extremes have the ability to output to RTMP through the hardware itself without having to necessarily go through a computer, even though this will have to be configured to hit your YouTube channel, Facebook channel, what have you. Instead of having a hard drive, you can connect to a phone and then you can tether or use the 5G or 4G signals from the phone so that you can stream remotely, which is kind of a cool feature. Once again, you can record to a flash drive. Now you got to make sure that that is fast enough. The T5 looks like it's the one that's supported, which is kind of cool. Something that is quite amazing is that it can save an XML or a file for DaVinci Resolve or another nonlinear editor, which will allow you to take the live switch and see each one of those individual cameras and remix or recut between those shots in post-production. And so it has this whole sync setup, which is quite amazing. You also have DaVinci Resolve, which comes with it. I believe it's the light version. And it does have a mix effects where you can do different fades and dips and wipes, just like you see in the high-end switchers. It does say that you can work with professional audio, but in my experience, the preamp on the ATEM lineup is not very good. So I would highly encourage you to go through your HDMI through embedded audio, which basically means you're plugging in your microphone to your camera and skipping that little preamp or that little 1/8 inch input that you see on the ATEM Mini Pros or Extremes. They're just not very good preamps. It's a lot to fit in a small device like that. So that would be my tip of the day. And of course it's 1080p, so you can see the different formats there. And there is converting that happens between the different frame rates and resolutions, which is also kind of cool. And of course, like we said before, it has the same software control. It has a keyer and it has graphic capabilities as well. So they're packing a lot into this. Now, the thing that stands out for a lot of professionals is that it can do super source. So it can do up to 4 different inputs plus 2 different layers with DVEs. So up to 6 different sources at the same time, which is kind of awesome. And the ATEMs can also control the Pocket 4K and the Pocket 6K cameras. So basically in the software, you can shade it without having that external shader, which we talked about. And that's a very innovative technology through HDMI, which a lot of other manufacturers are not currently doing. All right, finally, I've been talking about all these products, and now I get to tell you about some of the ideas and some of the thoughts, some of the speculation that I have around the 2ME upgrade. Where is it gonna fit? What is it gonna take from the ATEM Mini Extreme? What is it gonna take from the Constellation? And what are we gonna see? This is all speculation once again, but these are my thoughts and my hopes and dreams for Blackmagic. So if Blackmagic's listening, please take a few of these in account. I know this might be coming out in just a few months, so it might even be too late, but hey, I can only hope, right? I'm sure they're gonna be upgrading the whole lineup here of the great devices that I outlined. Again, I'm gonna focus on the 2ME and we'll trickle out if we can. Now, the 4ME, I do not think is gonna be replaced. So I'm gonna go ahead and scrap that out because the Constellation was kind of the upgrade to the 4ME. This Blackmagic Television Studio Pro has all of the things in one. There are a few different minor upgrades that can happen, but again, this is kind of the parent version of the lineup here, where you have the ATEM as the children, parent, and then the grandparents, right? So the grandparents are the ones I'm going to be focusing on. Okay, so here we are in the spreadsheet. I have the older models here, the 2015s from the ATEM Production Studio, the 1ME, 2ME, and 4ME, all listed here at the top. We have the ATEM Constellation listed here as well, and the ATEM Mini Extreme ISO here as well. I went ahead and guessed that the new name would be the ATEM Gemini 4K, ATEM Gemini Pro 4K, and the ATEM Gemini 8K. So I'm essentially predicting they're going to have 3 new models in their lineup and go from 4 down to 3. I think this 4ME is basically going to be replaced by the Constellation. So I think they're going to basically drop that and just keep these bottom 3. So that's my guesstimate. Based off of the Constellation name, I think that correlation between Constellation and Gemini is what they'll choose. And they like to add 4K or 8K at the end of it. We'll talk about more of that in a second. So the current price points, $1,700 basically, $2,500 and $4,000. So I'm guesstimating they might get a little bit more expensive. So let me go ahead and throw a couple numbers in here. It seems like every time there's a new product, they might hike the price up just a little bit. So it would make sense if these came up and were more expensive, especially if you're looking at the difference between the Extreme and then the Constellation to try to find a good balance between the two. I could even see this being like $6 or $7 grand, but I'm hoping if Blackmagic's good, they'll keep it like $5 grand or less, then more people could afford it. So resolutions, I'm guesstimating the first 2 will be 4K and this one will be 8K. The Gemini will have 4 inputs for HDMI and 4 for SDI. All of these will have scalers. For the Gemini Pro, I'm guesstimating 2 HDMI inputs and 10 SDI inputs. Gemini 8K, I think will have 2 HDMI and 20 SDI. That would probably mean that they're going to do that same quad link SDI, which takes 20 inputs down to 5. So that would be interesting if they did that. So that's always a possibility, but that would be really interesting if they did. I think it's nice to still have HDMI inputs, and you'll see on their older legacy products, they do have 1 HDMI that is available on each channel. Ideally, that could go up to 2 instead. That way you can run a primary and a backup computer, but it's really just going to depend. That's kind of a luxury, so they might just stick with 1 there. And then aux outs, I think they're going to move away from having a dedicated program out or a dedicated multi-view out like they did on some of the older switchers. So I think they're going to basically copy what they're doing with the Constellation and basically just make all of their outs aux out. So I'm saying 6, 8, and 12. I would love to see more from each one of these switchers, but I'm kind of guessing that they're going to do 6, 8, and 12 here. 1 DVE for the Gemini M Pro. And then the 8K, I think, might have 2. Same with the Super Source, just like it did in the older generation. That's been super helpful. But maybe there's got to be something that brings it above and beyond, because that Extreme has a Super Source. So I guess going to 2 is still better, but maybe instead of doing 4, it can do maybe 8 cameras within the same Super Source. I don't know how useful that's going to be or how often I would use it, but it might come in handy if I'm doing a Zoom or remote call. But of course, that would depend on a lot of hardware devices like laptops and computers to generate an image to go back into that hardware switcher. So, and that all compares versus the Constellation. Again, just trying to be realistic of what the Constellation offers versus what the Gemini product line might offer. Then we have media pools. So I'm basically guessing that the Constellation, which has 400 frames right now, that will be doubled and go to 800 for the 4K versions, and then up to 1200 and 4K, I guess I should note there. The 1200 frames would come from the 4K, and that would put us at about 300 frames at 8K. Maybe that should be like 1600 frames then, and 1200 frames. So I'm updating this a little bit as I go here, but I went ahead and guesstimated 800 frames at 4K, 1200 frames, and 1600 frames at 4K, which would allow the Gemini 8K to have 400 frames at 8K for the media pool. And for audio, because it's still a 2ME unit, I'm hoping that they'll have full-size XLR inputs. But what would also be super nice is if this could be recognized by Dante on the network. So what that means is you could basically send signal, audio signal specifically, to the ATEM over Dante. That way you never hit analog devices, and it's all digital signal from computers, from other devices. As long as it's on the same network, they could see and interact with each other. And so that would be a nice upgrade to be on the Dante network and to send and receive audio through the switcher in that sense. Now, ISO recording is where it gets interesting, because if you look at the rest of the product line, the ATEM Mini Extreme ISO is the only one that really has recording, and it could do a program and then 4 cameras. Right, so that's a total of 9 different 1080p feeds. Putting a dash here so it's nice and clear. I think it might make sense, and I would love to see this feature added, but essentially if you take 1080p and you make it into a quadrant, that's the equivalent of a single 4K stream. So maybe the bandwidth would be pretty similar for 2 4K feeds or streams, right? So that would be about the same bandwidth of these two. So for the ATEM Gemini, hopefully we could see 2 4K feeds being recorded. And then in the Gemini Pro, maybe there's 2 USBs that are dedicated for recording. So then we could see 4 4K feeds. And then in the Gemini 8K, that could be 8 4K feeds or 2 8K feeds. Hopefully that's not too confusing. I know with ISO recordings, kind of a wish list kind of item, because they're basically cannibalizing the HyperDeck line if they introduce recordings into this device. So more than likely, they're not going to have ISO recording built in, but hey, let's all wish for the best here. Now, camera control is kind of interesting, because right now, everything except for the Extreme is being controlled over SDI. I think that will be the same with the Gemini product line, but what would be awesome is to see fiber built into the system and to have a more direct connection between fiber between the camera and the switcher. So that's why I put camera control to also list as fiber. So that would be an interesting thing if they added that. For comms, you can see the different comm options across the board. I think it would be cool to go to a TRRS connector, which will allow you to have a smaller headset, prosumer headset. If not, I could easily see the 5-pin XLR being across these 3 items as well. That one's kind of a toss-up. Even though the TRRS connectors are going to be more universal and cheaper, the traditional headsets are the 5-pin XLRs. As far as multi-view goes, I think 2 will be on the Gemini 4K, 2 will be on the Pro, and then 4 would be on the Gemini 8K. That's just me hoping. More than likely, this will also be 2, but hey, let's hope for the best. Stingers, I would love to see stingers on all of these. So now that I've updated this column, you'll see that pretty much everything but the ISO and the Production Studio 4K switchers have stingers. I wouldn't be surprised if the Extreme also added stinger transitions to its lineup via a software update, so we'll see in the future if that gets added. I would expect that all of the new switchers, the Gemini lineup, will also have stinger transitions built in. Now here's an interesting one. multiple RTMP outputs. So in the ATEM Mini Extreme, you can stream out of this device directly and hit an RTMP feed. So I'm pretty confident that this is also going to be added to the Gemini lineup, but what I'm really hoping for is to have multiple RTMP outputs. So basically you could do network monitoring to send this over network. I don't know if this is going to be an NDI product because of the feedback that I got on office hours, but maybe they'll have their own RTMP kind of setup, especially because they released the Stream Bridge product. So maybe this could output to, say, a Stream Bridge locally, but also internationally as well. So that would be an interesting upgrade. And really the back half of this chart is all about the wild cards here, the things that I'm guessing at, the things that I'm hoping for. And one of those other things would definitely be fiber. So that's one of them too. That's kind of the wild card here. I don't know what they'll provide with the switchers, but I'm hoping that they'll have at least a few switchers that have fiber modules directly connected to them. So if I was to guess, maybe they would have half the modules for each one of these switchers, but maybe they'll do the full lineup and not do SDI. That's kind of one of those interesting things that we'll see what they do with that. I'm going to go ahead and expand the dream here and talk about NDI. So NDI is a network-based video system. And so New Tech is the originator. I've been on a YouTube show called Office Hours, and one of the panelists talked about having some contacts within the Blackmagic New Tech world. And there's a little bit of a clash of heads there because essentially they're competing technologies, right? So you have the traditional video switching setup, which is SDI or HDMI based system. That's kind of traditional broadcast television and live event setup. And then you have the new dog in town, which is NDI. Even though NDI, I think, has been around for about 10 years, these are two different methods of accomplishing the same thing. So NDI allows you to have multiple network-based cameras. And so instead of using SDI, use Ethernet cable to connect everything together. You can recognize cameras over Ethernet. It does introduce a few things like compression and latency over that video signal. And with that latency, that basically means delay. You don't always have the cameras succinct. So if you have some cameras that are SDI and some NDI, then there needs to be some sort of balancing that happens in the software, and delaying video is very resource intensive. So even though it's a hope of mine that NDI will be a part of the new ATEM 2 AME production switcher, from my research and everything that I've learned about so far, NDI is probably not going to be included in this newest upgrade. And then I also listed PTZ. So this would be pan, tilt, zoom controls over the switcher. The ATEM lineup can control cameras in that sense. And we saw that primarily with the Television Studio Pro 4K with the little joystick and stuff at the top. I don't expect that to be on the new Gemini models that I mentioned. However, I think there will be a separate PTZ controller that's offered, and that's a whole nother video in itself. Now that we've dreamed through all this, hopefully you have a better picture of what Blackmagic could offer in their future switchers. And again, this is all speculation, but hopefully this has been fun for you to see and kind of speculate with me. What are your thoughts? Are there some things that I missed that you wish would be in the switcher? Please leave some comments below. Thanks for checking this one out. I know we went in depth with all the different switchers and all the different lineups, but hopefully we'll see some product updates soon. Thanks for watching this one, and we'll see you in the next one.